It's a great read. It does a lot to verify rumors around the story and answer bigger questions, like how the Apache were able to survive in the mountains from the 1880s on forward. First, the Apache were incredibly resourceful. They could hunt and forage for everything available in their environment, but they were not completely self-sufficient. They were not farmers, at least not at scale. They had to raid to supplement their needs. Most of the time, they wouldn't bother anyone. They were extremely cautious. Raids were small. They would take a cow or two from a farm here or there, rarely the same farm, at least not in a short time period. They knew to spread out what they took. Some of the farmers even claimed to know the Apache were doing it. They kind of viewed it as a tax. They knew if they went after them, they were never going to find the Apache. But if they tried, they would paint a rather large target on their back. They were a terrifying people to make an enemy out of. So no, let them take a cow here or there and they will simply return to the mountains. Some Broncos likely made visits occasionally to San Carlos or the Mescaleros reservation. They would receive help from the Apache there. The Broncos were holdouts from the Indian Wars. The Apache there, although aging, likely knew who some of the Broncos were. There are enough sightings and accounts from people on reservation that make these visits almost certain. Lastly, sometimes they would simply walk into Mexican towns and trade. Many Apache spoke Spanish, at least enough to get by. There are reports of Apache camps discovered that had Mexican clothes. Dressed that way, speaking Spanish, many could go easily unnoticed, especially as many of the Apache were of mixed heritage. Lupe said that Apache Juan would do this, walk through towns, completely unnoticed. By 1930, Fimbres' attempts to rescue his son had garnered some regional attention. The Mexican government was hesitant to provide any assistance, at least officially, but Fimbres was able to get some support from eager volunteers in the United States. The Douglas Daily Dispatch invited people to enlist, and pretty soon American volunteers outnumbered Mexicans. Their enthusiasm didn't go unnoticed. Some applicants wrote in asking to be included. I am not going to take the time to read them out loud, but I have posted 3 here if you want to pause and check them out. The venture was sold as the last Apache hunt, and the volunteers reflected that sentiment. But before it could get underway, the Mexican government shut it down. They were getting a little nervous at the idea of having hundreds of American militants on their soil, many of them not hiding the fact that they were also interested in the rumors of gold, silver, and copper in those mountains. But even without his volunteers, Fimbres escalated his pursuit, and his efforts paid off. In 1931, this bombshell hit the front page of the Arizona Daily Star. Quote, "Revengeful father returns with Indian scalps." End quote. In April 1930, after the punitive force of Americans was grounded by the government, Fimbres moved with 12 men from the Corichico on horseback. They were following a new lead and scouring an area of the Sierra Madre they had never been to before. Broncos had recently ambushed a small group between the Corichico and Casas Grandes. A few days in, they spot sign of Apache and smoke from a campfire. They approach the area in silence and with the utmost caution. At first, they see just 2 Apache, women. The group took aim and fired at them, hitting one in the arm. She screams Nakaye, the Apache word for Mexicans. The other yells for help, and she calls Apache Juan by name. Before the women can get away, the posse fires a second volley and kills them both. The Mexicans see other Apache fleeing into the forest, but Apache Juan ran toward the group and began firing back, staying behind to defend his tribe, despite being drastically outnumbered. Fimbres' team was able to pin him down behind cover before one of the group flanked him. The initial shot injured him before the group moved in and finished what they started. In the silence after the fight, the Mexicans then inspected the camp. They took valuables like saddles, rifles, as well as Apache trinkets that they found as souvenirs. But before they left, they made 2 very serious mistakes. They scalped the dead, and they left the bodies unburied and in the open. Fimbres hoped that by being so brazen, that maybe the Apache would fear him, and they would free Geraldo to get them off their backs. But that's not what they do, and this is not that kind of story.
When my life gets crazy, my good food choices are the first to go.
That is perfect for when I don't have time to cook.
I gotta get this in the fridge because it's fresh and made by chefs.
Put this in the microwave for 2 minutes.
They've got steak, they've got salmon.
They got keto, protein plus, and cottage smart.
I can't believe this delicious and it's helping me lose weight.
This is the meal I picked up on the app.
And they come delivered right to your door.
I can't believe we didn't do the soda.
catastrophe there.
Now they've got to wake up. They've got to get on the back foot, clear the head a little bit, then jump back into it again. It's all about the hustle. Get back in.
File free in the app if you didn't use this last year. Just file with TurboTax Do-It-Yourself by February 18th. All tax forms and all situations. From super parents to side hustlers to stellar investors and star students. Get the app now.
Combination work together. One punch is good, two punches better.
The image published in the Arizona Daily Star is, in essence, a victory photo. Despite the warnings of Lupe, Fimbres thought this was the path to getting his son: fear and intimidation. The Mexican government took this tactic throughout the last century, but all of that history with the Apache should have told him that it wouldn't work. Failing to understand the Apache cost him everything. A couple days after the expedition that killed Apache Juan and the two women, two Mexican men riding horses in the area of the fight caught the smell of decay and investigated. The three Apache who were left out in the open had been carefully buried by their companions when they later returned. But next to their graves was another. Buried shallow and with his legs sticking out was the body of Geraldo. There were obvious signs of torture. He would have been about 7. Accounts from friends of Fimbres say that at this point he was a broken man. His primary motivation before was to get his son back. Now he only lived for revenge. Blood feuds dominate the story of Native American history, and this one is no different. A piece of tragic irony in this story is that from Fimbres' perspective, his mission came from wanting vengeance for his wife and to save his son. But that attack was likely not a random act of violence. Around 1915, 12 years before the attack on the Fimbres family, the Broncos had stolen some cattle, and a group of ranchers, including Fimbres, caught up to them. In doing so, they capture a young Apache girl. She lived with the Fimbres family for a while before being baptized and adopted by another. She believed, since she was taken, that Nacori Chico was constantly being watched, and that the Fimbres family was marked by Apache Juan and her mother. At one point, a few years after her capture, she asked to rejoin her people, and the community decided to let her. She went up into the mountains and found her family. But she was told that she was no longer welcome with the Apache, and that if she returned, that they would kill her. That little girl was Lupe. The same Lupe who had been giving Fimbres advice since the attack in 1927. She believed that the woman who pulled Maria off that horse was her mother, and that taking Geraldo was essentially an exchange. A child for a child. She also believed, from the descriptions given to her from Fimbres, that the Apache women killed in 1930 was her mother and her sister. The violence between the Broncos and the Fimbres family had been going on now for nearly 2 decades, but it wasn't over. In 1934, Grenville Goodwin estimated that there were around only 30 of these Broncos left. He made these estimates based on the amount of cattle taken on ranches in the area and what the Apache would need in food in order to sustain themselves. It's for sure not a perfect estimate, but it does give us a starting point. He wrote of the Broncos, quote, "They are fighting a losing battle in Mexico, and it seems only a question of time till they will be exterminated," end quote. But news didn't travel especially fast to the United States, and by 1934, that may have already happened. Despite his attempts, Grenville Goodwin missed some news. He had issues with tuberculosis and was out of commission for large chunks of time in the 1930s. There is an incomplete record, and frankly, at this point in the story, I am not sure what is true and what is legend. Some of the conflicts appear to be reported twice by different people on different timelines with different details, but this is what can be put together. In the spring of 1933, several sources claim Fimbres led a group of ranchers on an expedition that killed 24 Apache. But that fight mirrors one reported in 1932, in which far less Apache are killed. In both, 3 children are taken, each of them dying within a year. There was a report out of Tucson in September of 1934 that is eerily similar to one in 1935, in which a group including Fimbres ambushed Apache coming down from cover in the mountains following a heavy snow. What does seem consistent is that in 1935, reports stopped. So, were all the Apache dead? I don't think so. In 1937, a Norwegian explorer, Helge Ingstad, led an expedition into the Sierra Madres in search of any remaining Apache. He didn't find them, leading many to assume they were all gone. But there is more to that story. First is that the expedition may have found more than was reported. Ingstad had 2 Apache guides. One of them, Yanoza, was a former warrior who had surrendered with Geronimo way back in 1886. At one point during the expedition, Ingstad separated from his guides for a few days. They never told him, but reported to people on reservation later that they didn't find any Apache, but they did find a camp with evidence of Apache there recently. Whether that is true or not, I have no idea. But a year later, in 1938, Grenville Goodwin was visiting the Mescaleros Reservation. There he was told by 2 separate people of wild Apache who had visited the year before. The witnesses said they spoke Spanish. And in the decades that followed, there are other rumors that are hard to ignore. There was a story of a woman in Colorado who said her parents were from a small settlement in the mountains west of Chihuahua City. They would tell stories of their village and say that everyone there was related. She said that when her children were little, her parents would speak to them in Apache. They left the village in the 1950s. An anthropologist named Tom Hinton met a man who spoke with 4 men describing themselves as Apache in 1948 in the area south of Nacori Chico. The people who live in this area are mostly mountain Pimas, Native Americans. Hinton was told the men were wearing buckskin clothing and moccasins, and that they claimed to have been descended from the Chiricahua. It's not unlikely that a small number who survived moved to different locations or assimilated themselves into small Mexican towns or communities. But a more romanticized view is that maybe a small population still lives out there. The region is unbelievably rural. The land is there. And to this day, every so often, someone reports having seen them. It's not likely, but I know if I ever find myself in the Sierra Madre, the most terrifying thing I can imagine is getting the feeling of being watched, or hearing sounds I can't quite explain. It seems like every free second I am trying to read more about history or respond to comments from the channel, something that means I'm
Bottled water is known for having microplastics, and boiling it does not remove all of the harmful substances from the water. Puragain's filter system removes up to 99% of harmful substances. It includes fluorine, lead, chemicals, bacteria, pesticides, and PFAS. I feel good knowing that I'm providing my family with clean water for cooking and drinking. There's lifetime servicing and a 7-year warranty. Switching to Puragain water was one of the best decisions that I've ever made for my family.
Just defense, work on defense, blocking and stopping and shooting.
I know you've been seeing all the news about the crazy stuff these celebrities are doing at those parties with the baby oil. The news is telling us they confiscated about 1,000 bottles. And his lawyer said that there's a Costco down the block, which is where they getting all this from. Everybody going to be coming out now about some messed up situation they seen at one of these parties in LA. But what they won't tell you is that there is something even bigger going on, and they just using all this.
Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. The American frontier in the mid to late 1800s was a dangerous place for new settlers. The Southwest was home to Native Americans like the Apache, who were raiding people. A brutal reputation and expertise in stealth made them terrifying, and they would live up to their reputation. If settlers were lucky, they got away with their property or cattle before they even knew that they were there. But many were not lucky. Raiding societies inevitably have high mortality rates. In order to sustain your population, kidnapping your rival's children becomes a viable option. Today, we will explore the stories of 2 of the most significant kidnappings ever committed by the Apache. The first is the story of Mickey Free, whose abduction caused a war between the Americans and the Chiricahua. The second is the story of Charlie McComas, a young boy whose kidnapping remains one of the great mysteries of the late 1800s. But before we get started, I research historical topics I find interesting and explain them in a way I would to my friends. If that is your kind of thing, please subscribe and leave a like on the video. If you really like it, share it. It supports me and will help grow the channel. But let's get to our stories. Mickey Free was one of the most famous of the Apache scouts. Look through the images. He comes up constantly because between 1872 and 1886, he was present on the majority of major military campaigns